I want to share a little about my journey and how I got to this particular conversation. So more than a decade ago, I actually was working for an international association focused on ending HIV and hepatitis. And at that time, I was hired as the first ever full-time communication staff person. And when I was brought on board, I was tasked with building out the department, putting in place a strategy for that particular organization, and putting in place all the processes for our communications for internal communication, but also externally with our members and other stakeholders that we work with. And I really enjoyed the work that I was doing. But if I'm being completely honest, there were many moments where I felt like I was teetering on the brink of burnout, right? I see lots of heads nodding right now, right? Trying to do it all, feeling like no matter how much time, no matter how much energy, no matter how smart, how long I worked, that there simply wasn't enough time and resources to get it all done. So how many folks can relate to that, right? Lots of hands going up. And so unfortunately, that is an experience that many mission-driven change makers have, right? And there's research that actually shows for mission-driven folks, we actually experience, in part because of that, higher levels of burnout, chronic illness, challenges with relationships, both personal and professionally, and the list sort of goes on and on from there. But fortunately for me, at my lowest point, actually, I was, really depressed. I was overweight. I had really disengaged from the reason that I was actually doing the work to begin with. But what was fortunate in my situation is that was actually a turning point for me. That was actually a turning point to ask the question, well, how can we actually shift from what I saw as a normalized culture of burnout to a sustained culture of well-being? What are the steps that we actually take to do that? And I began to ask myself this question, so specifically with mission-driven work. So if all the folks are burning out, right, and we're normalizing this cycle of burnout in this context, then who would ever be around long enough to actually do the work, right? To actually have the impact that we're looking for, and so that long-term sustained impact for our communities, for the people that we're serving, and ultimately out in the world. And so I want to share about my journey, and I'll share with you some practical tips that I hope will be helpful for you as an individual so that you can sustain yourself, and then hopefully that sustenance can be something that you can overflow into the work that you're doing in your personal life and also in the professional context. So what we're going to focus on today, we're going to focus on challenges of what I describe as well-being while well-doing. So this is the language that I describe essentially when we talk about mission-driven work. We're describing what I'm talking about in terms of how we take care of ourselves while we're actually doing those things. I'm going to share with you a simple framework just that really help you wrap your heads around this. And then we're going to talk just about some simple bite-sized strategies, because I want to leave you with something that you can actually put into practice right now to begin to maybe see a small shift in how it is that you're approaching your work in a more sustainable way. And so who am I? So I am Meico Marquette Whitlock. I describe myself as a workplace well-being strategist and trainer. What that means is that I work with mission-driven organizations all around the world around creating healthy workplace cultures. And so the work that I do is focused on doing speaking and training, similar to what I'm doing right here now, but also really the tactical nitty-gritty work of going into organizations, assessing where you are in terms of your culture of well-being or not having a culture of well-being, and working with you to put in place strategies and programs to really begin to make that shift, and really shifting from a lot of what I see with organizations as a starting point, which is the transactional, perhaps learning and development, where you have a class or you have the once a year retreat, but then things sort of just go back to normal. My intention, my vision is to really shift that so that we move from that type of transactional work to more durable, sustained transformation inside of organizations and ultimately in terms of the impact that we're having as a whole. And so I come to this work having worked most of my career in nonprofit and government, but I've also worked in the private sector as well. But that work specifically in what I saw in nonprofit and government really informs how I think about the work that I'm doing today. I am an Amazon bestselling author. I'll talk a bit about that in the moment. For those that are interested in the framework that we're going to talk about, it's actually pulled from that book. And I believe that I make the world's best vegan chili. So I'm just going to put that out there. So if anyone is interested in the slides and you're interested in the recipe, you can email me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share the recipe and the slides with you after today's session. So, are y'all ready to rock and roll? That doesn't sound enthusiastic. Are y'all ready to rock and roll? All right. All right. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk a little bit about the challenge. And then I want to move into framework and some solutions to really help you to get started, to begin to put this into action right away. So these are some of the common challenges that I see with the clients that I work with. Some of this is validated by survey research that other folks have done, but these are some of the top things that I'm seeing. By no means the only things, but some of the top ones, which include the prolonged uncertainty. Some of that was highlighted by the fact that the pandemic has really shifted how we think about our life and our work. Some of our job roles have changed and have not shifted back, right? There's uncertainty about what the future of AI is going to be in terms of impacting our work and how we go about that. The future of hybrid, remote, in-person, we're still having conversations about that with a lot of organizations that I focus on. And so this is a very real challenge that we're dealing with in terms of well-being in the workplace. Social atrophy. So for folks that are familiar with relationship expert, Esther Perel talks about this idea about how we connect and how we develop connection. We're really beginning to see a shift in that, right? Part of that has to do with the impact of the pandemic and sort of the residual impact of that. Part of it has to do with a generational shift that we're seeing in terms of how people prefer to communicate and connect. And then, of course, the technology piece, right? So the fact that we are mediating so much of our interaction and connection via screens, that also impacts the quality of our connections and how we are connecting. Collaboration and tech overload is also connected to this. We're spending more time than ever connected to our screens, and certainly that has positive benefits, but it also, depending on how we're using it and the quality of that screen time, it can also be detrimental in a number of ways. So I see that repeatedly in the work that I do. And actually, when I first started this work, I'm branded as the mindful techie. And part of that is because when I first started, that was really one of the number one challenges that folks were dealing with in terms of the increase in collaboration overload and folks feeling like they're spending so much time inside and outside of work connected to their devices and responding to Slack and responding to emails that they didn't really have time to actually do the work, right? Or to be able to do it in a deep way. And so I actually do a lot of specific training on this particular aspect of this issue. Intention deficit disorder, or something that I call IDD, right? So we're moving through life sometimes on autopilot, and because of the sheer volume of things that are on our plates, we end up in a place of constant reacting, right? Reacting to the emails, reacting to the to-do list. If you're a caregiver, you're reacting to the needs of the person that you are caring for at home, for example. And that leaves little space for us to actually take time to pause and to think, what is my highest intention for my life in this moment? What's my highest intention for what I want to achieve at work in this particular season? And am I actually focusing on the priorities that are actually going to move me there? Or am I just responding and reacting to all the things that are coming at me? Workplace burnout. And so I don't have to say much about that. I think we all sort of get what that is, but that is something that I continue to see at the top of the list when I do pre and post surveys with the learning and development opportunities that I'm engaged in. This is something that folks are perpetually challenged with. And then finally, hypercomplexity, right? So we are living in a place and a time where the rate of change is so rapid, it's unrelenting, and it can feel like it's really hard to keep up. And all of these and many more culminate into an effect that a good friend of mine, Nicola Brown, refers to as swirling, right? So it's this idea that you have these co-occurring factors here that contribute to the idea that maybe you're feeling like you're swept up in a tornado and maybe hard to get your feet on the ground, right? Maybe hard to find a sense of grounding. And another way that I've heard it described by some clients is feeling like you are perpetually treading water, right? Or you're perpetually feeling like you are trying to catch your breath and you're never quite able to really get a really good deep breath. So how many folks can relate to this or can place someone that you know in something that you see here? Okay, so almost all the hands went up when I said that. So two more things I want to add to this that I'm saying as well is unacknowledged grief and loss. I saw this a lot during the pandemic, and I am heartened that we're beginning to have the conversation, But what I'm also seeing is that many organizations aren't skilled at making space for employees to acknowledge grief. And we're not just talking about grief in terms of loss of loved ones. When we think about the pandemic, for example, we're talking about a loss of a way of life that is not going to return for some of us, right? We're talking about the loss of a future that for some of us we thought we were going to have, but it's going to be completely different from what we had envisioned for ourselves, perhaps for our kids. There's a whole host of things that go into this grief bucket. And one of the reasons that this is important is because grief can sometimes show up as a form of neurodivergence, right? And that type of impact in the workplace means that it impacts your ability to be able to focus, to pay attention, to be fully present, right? So we have to have skillful ways that we are acknowledging this and working with this. And then the final thing I want to share with you, which is this idea. I see lots of people sort of responding to what I have up here, which is the idea that we are, for some of us, maybe in a state of feeling perpetually exhausted, right? And maybe you've gone to the doctor, maybe you talk to your therapist, and they say, well, you're not really depressed. There's nothing wrong with you, but you still feel perpetually tired and exhausted by the sheer volume of things that are on your plate. The idea of just thinking about Monday morning, all the things that you have to do for work, for life, taking care of yourself, your kids, your parents, all of these things, it can contribute to this idea that you just feel exhausted just by being. People can relate to this? Yes. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, and so I don't want to leave you there, but I want to take some time to actually hear a bit, just very briefly from you, and then we're going to dive into framework and solutions. So I'm just curious, just popcorn style, what's one of the biggest challenges that you're experiencing with well-being at work right now? Anyone have anything they wanted to shout out? Yes. Absolutely. So travel and having your schedule thrown off. Yes. Yes. Nonstop meeting culture, right? Yes. Yes. So going back to the social atrophy that I talked about earlier. Yes. Thank you. I saw a hand over here. Yes. There is a such thing as over collaboration. I mean, if it's getting in the way of you actually doing the work that's generated by all the collaboration, that is, yes, and we'll take one more. Yes. So like it can be perfunctory, right? So you're showing up, you have this on the calendar, so we might as well just meet and take up this space, but then it's not as productive as it probably could be, right? We're not actually using it. Or maybe it doesn't need to exist, or maybe we need to cancel it, but we don't have perhaps the authority to do that, right? So that can be a bit of a challenge. So these are things, all the things that you all have shared today are very common in terms of what I hear when I'm working with teams and organizations. And so what I want to do as we look at the second half of today's presentation, I want to talk about a framework for, again, what I describe as well-being while well-doing. And this is described in more detail in the book that I mentioned earlier, so How to Thrive When Work Doesn't Love You Back, available exclusively on Amazon if you're interested in that, or you can go to mindfultechie.com and learn a bit more about that. I'm also happy to share for folks that want to connect via email or LinkedIn, and you want to ask about the book. I'm happy to share more details about it that way as well. So the first thing I want to share with you, though, is something that I call the Mindful Changemaker Spheres of Impact. So when we think about impact, particularly in the mission-driven context, often we're thinking about centering either the client or the cause that we're serving, or we're thinking perhaps even more broadly about the world at large. And that certainly is one part of it. But from my perspective, it really starts with us as the individuals, right? And so some of the challenges that we might experience with burnout, disengagement from our mission, for example, feeling overwhelmed, some of that has to do with the fact that we're jumping headfirst into these outer layers of the spheres of impact first. And what happens when we do that is that we might experience short-term success, but what happens for many of us is that we end up burned out, or depleted. And so the invitation here with this framing is for you to think about what it might mean to center yourself first so that you're replenishing yourself in a consistent way. And you're having ripples of impact through these other spheres through the overflow of the nourishment that you're providing for yourself. I liken it to something that you might have heard if you fly often from flight attendants about the mask, right? So in the event of an emergency, your oxygen mask might drop down, and the invitation is always that you secure your own oxygen mask first before you assist someone else. It's the same thing here, right? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in reacting to all the things that are happening in our life and in our work that we can think of this sort of as like a nice to have when I have time or when I have space for that, not recognizing that it's actually an essential component to being able to have durable, sustained impact with the work that we're doing. And so taking this further, I want to share with you something that I call the change commitments for well-being while well-doing. So these are 6 commitments that really are a way to get the pulse of where you are in terms of sustaining yourself so that you can do this work in a sustainable way at any particular point in time or any season. And one of the ways that I think about these is sort of like if you are looking at like the dashboard of a car, you have the odometer, you have the gas gauge, you have the oil gauge. All of those instruments, all of those gauges are really important for understanding how well the car is functioning, right? And so similarly, you want to be able to understand where you are with each of these commitments in terms of understanding how well you're functioning in terms of your own well-being. So very briefly, these are about how connected you are, how clear you are about your why in a particular moment, right? So this can be personal, this can be professional, this could be a mix of both. Are you honoring your priorities that are actually aligned with that why? Or are you simply reacting to all the things that are coming at you? Are you acknowledging the resistance that comes up, right? Those limiting doubts, the imposter syndrome, the beliefs and all those things. Are you actually constructively working through those as they come up, as you're moving through the process of working with your why and honoring your priorities? Are you consistently and constructively negotiating and renegotiating boundaries that actually allow you the space to focus on those priorities? Are you generating the space to go within? So going back to what I talked about in terms of secure your own oxygen mask, we're really good at managing the projects and all the things on our plate professionally, but where are you on your calendar, right? Where do you situate yourself in your schedule? And then finally, how well are you doing with bringing these all together when we think about what I describe as embodying well-being while well-doing? And so I want you all to think about this, and we're going to come back to this in a moment. So if you have pen and paper or if you have taking notes digitally, we're going to do a quick exercise where you can really quickly assess where you are with these commitments right now. And so the final thing that I want to share on this point about the framing here is about the importance of taking an integrated approach to this, of doing what I describe as the inner work and the outer work, or what I describe as mindful change making. So why is this important? So typically when we talk about this topic in the workplace context, we are focused on people and project management. We're focused on those types of things, right? And so even when it comes to training or when it comes to interventions, we're focused on, our people need to be trained more effectively on how to supervise or how to manage their time better. Well, that's certainly an aspect of that, and that's certainly an aspect of the work that I do with organizations. But there's another important part of this, which is about the inner work aspect of it. So how are we skillfully helping our folks and ourselves navigate the mental and emotional aspect of this? How are we doing with helping folks to make space for identifying the things they can do to replenish themselves on a continual basis? How are we doing with helping folks to navigate the trickiness of those relationships, especially when it comes to perhaps setting boundaries and navigating those boundaries when it comes to making space to actually do some of these things in a very real way? Doing this in a consistent way, doing this in an integrated way, allows us to do what I'm calling the mindful change making. So far so good? All right, so y'all ready to put this into action a little bit? All right, awesome. Okay, so we're going to do a quick assessment here. And what I'm going to ask you to do is identify what I'm calling your change score. And so for each of the commitments that I've listed here, I want to invite you on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not so great, 10 being knocking it out of the park. I want you just to give yourself an assessment of where you are right now with each of these commitments as you understand them. And I want you to think of this as not necessarily an assessment or a test or maybe a way to judge yourself, but think of it as simply collecting information. It's very similar to the way that we might think about using a GPS, where a GPS is asking for your starting point so it can help you to get to where you want to go. It's not judging your starting point, it's simply asking you where you are. So take a moment to think about where you are in each of these measures right now, very briefly. And this is something that you can do over and over again to just get a really quick baseline level assessment of where you are. And then once you have done that, I want to invite you to think about, as you look at your scores, which commitment right now in this moment has the lowest score for you. And if you have a tie with the lowest scores, I want you to think about which commitment might be the most resonant for you in this moment if you were to pick a place to start. And one of the reasons I'm asking you to think about this is because when we think about these 6 commitments in an aggregate, it might be overwhelming to figure out where you start. And so identifying the lowest score can be one way you think about what's my entry point, what's my starting point. If I were to leave here today and I was just to focus on one thing, can I identify an activity that's connected to that lowest score and commitment that I might focus on? Making sense to folks? Okay, excellent. All right, everyone has the scores? Okay, excellent. All right, so as you think about your scores, I want you to think about that as you leave here today, and I'm going to talk toward the end of this about a few questions that you can consider to figure out how you make this more concrete. But in the meantime, what I want to do for you is I want to share a few examples of strategies, and these are just as a starting point. I'm not positing this as like this is going to like change your life like right now in the next 30 seconds, right? This is just to help you incrementally begin to see a shift and just give you some ideas about what are the types of things that you can do to make a shift depending on where it is that you're starting. So one of the first is something that I call right-sizing your start and your start routines, right? And so tell me your name in the back. You talked about traveling and your routine being thrown off. Annabelle. Okay, so Annabelle gave us a really good example. And I'm in your situation now because I traveled to be here. And one of my challenges with that is that with exercise, for example, I'm not always able to do my full routine when I'm traveling, right? The schedule changes, right? Your body reacting differently, particularly if you're in a different time zone. And so one of the things I want to invite you to consider is that when we think about routines and the barriers that get in the way of those in terms of start and stop routines, and what I think of as activities that you have for yourself to nourish yourself. And you can think about this perhaps in the context of the start and the stop of your workday, or if your workday sort of flows over into different aspects of your day, you can think about how you might want to, put these throughout your day. But the bigger thing I want you to consider is that sometimes we think that we have to do it the same way, the same time, the same length every day. And we feel like, okay, well, I can't do my normal 30-minute meditation, so I'm just not going to do anything at all, right? But what if you gave yourself permission to say, you know what, I'm not able to do 30 minutes today, but what if I did the 1-minute version or the 5-minute version or the 10-minute version? And what if you took the time to actually identify what those might look like ahead of time so that when you find yourself in those spaces and those times where you have to right size, you don't have to think about it. You already have it in your toolkit. You can just say, you know what, I got the 5-minute meditation I'm going to do, and I can give myself credit for actually checking it off and doing that. So one small example, one small way that you can maybe make a tweak that might help you overcome some barriers or resistance you might be having to actually, perhaps, for example, generating space to make some of these things happen. Another thing I want to share with you is a framework that I call acing your mindset. So how many of you have heard a phrase like, I aced the exam, right? So, okay. So think about that in that context. So acing your mindset is a 3-step process that really talks about acknowledging, confronting, and executing. So we're talking about acknowledging those limiting beliefs, those doubts, those fears, that imposter syndrome, confronting it, right? So that could be through therapy, that could be through affirmations, your mindfulness practice, many different ways you can think about that. And then execution, right? So what's my next constructive action step that I can take based on where I am, right? So it's a very simple framing here, and more details in the book for folks that are interested in diving a little bit deeper. So again, just a taste to give you a sense of the types of strategies you might be able to start with, depending on where you're starting with your change score. So one final thing I want to share with you, which is important, I think, no matter where you're starting or where you're at, which is about remembering to give ourselves a little bit of grace and being kind to ourselves. Sometimes one of the biggest barriers that we have is we're not able to give ourselves enough credit for just being able to show up. And I believe that no matter how we're showing up, and no matter how other people are showing up or how we might want them to show up, I believe that ultimately we're doing the best that we can with what we have right where we are. And sometimes we have to be in a place where we're constantly reminding ourselves of that. And over time, what that allows us to do is it helps us to expand our capacity to be able to extend that to other folks. And in the workplace context, one of the things that does is it makes room for people to feel safe being imperfect. That it's okay to not get it right. That it's okay to mess up. And we can then have a conversation about it. And then we can figure out constructively, how do we move forward? How do we improve? How do we learn and grow and evolve together, as opposed to creating this place that sort of strains psychological safety, and then folks don't feel comfortable really doing that. And it's not healthy. It's not helpful for anyone. And so on the individual and the organizational level, I want to just extend that reminder to you and that invitation. And so as we wrap up, I want you to, as you think about that lowest score and commitment, I want you to think about what it might mean to shift from being interested in the idea of change or taking action coming out of today to actually committing to that. You all have been in a lot of sessions throughout the conference, right? A lot of great ideas, a lot of things that sound good, but how many are you actually committed to following through on, right? There's a difference between being interested and being committed. So I want to plant that seed for you, and I want to give you a set of questions to think about as you think about how you might take action. And I know that this is a room full of overachievers. I can just see it on your faces. And I know that for some of you, you feel like perhaps this is too simplistic as a starting point, or maybe you feel like, oh, well, we need a plan, but it needs to be 100 pages and it has to have footnotes, all right? I want to offer to you that as a starting point leaving here today, if how you're going to take action requires more than an index card, you might be doing too much as a starting place. So what might it mean to create what I'm just going to describe as your index card well-being plan, and to think about a few simple questions? What do you actually want in the next 90 days? What's your vision for your well-being? What do you want it to look like? What do you want it to feel like? What resources do you actually have access to right now? I know you don't have all the resources that you would like to have, but what do you have access to right now in this moment? What can you actually tap into if you were to leave this room right now that you have access to? And then if you think about the next 7 days, you don't have to do all the things. You can just do one thing. Call HR and ask about your EAP plan, right? Think about your 1 minute, 5 minute, 10-minute version of your workout routine. So next time you travel, you have some options that you can consider. And then finally, who are you going to invite to go on this journey with you? Accountability is so important. Community is critical as we do this work. And so who will you ask to hold you accountable? And so one final thought that I want to leave you with is a favorite saying that I really love. It's a Haitian proverb that essentially says that behind the mountains, there are mountains. Behind the mountains, there are mountains. And for me, I interpret this to mean that in our life and in our work, there's always going to be challenges, obstacles, resistance that we encounter. But one of the beautiful things is if we think of these as the mountains in our life and our work, we can practice climbing those mountains. And with practice, we get stronger. And so my hope is that coming out of today, I know you all have spent a lot of research and a lot of sort of heavy topics. Before, this was like 2 PhD guys talking about evaluation, right? All of that is wonderful. But my hope is that there's at least one thing that I share with you in this last half hour that's going to support you in getting stronger at climbing those mountains in your work and life ahead. So I want to thank you all for your time. I'm going to put up my contact information. So for folks that want that recipe, you want the slides, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you all.